Hello everyone and welcome to this devlog. I've been working on technical aspects of the game for the past 2 episodes, making complex node graphs, but today we work on something very different: gameplay and game design. As I have previously explained, you play as a ship who has to deliver cargo to different ports in an unknown world. So you have to explore the world and to compare it with your map to figure out your position and your destination. That's the basic concept, and I have actually added a few different ideas since the last video. First of all, in the previous version you simply had one objective, which was one port. So you had to figure out where you were, where that port was, and simply get there. Now you can have multiple journeys, so it can be 2, 3, 4, with 2 ports. So you have to first go to one to get a package, and then you have to deliver it to another port. That means that the first step in the game is actually figuring out the way you want to take to optimize your time with all these different journeys. To help with that, the player is now able to write on the map how to plan their path. The second change that I made is that the player now starts with a much simpler map than before. Instead of having all the information and landmarks of the world that they are about to explore, they only get the landmasses and the port. Now, to fill up the map, they have to search for different map fragments around the world. At first, I had made an automatic system that would randomly reveal some landmarks around the map when they found the fragments, which I think did look quite satisfying. But I did get another idea a few days ago, which I think makes things a bit more challenging and interesting. Map fragments are now physical objects that actually represent a small part of the map, but with the landmarks. So when the player finds one, they have to study the fragment to find out which part of the map they are linked to, and then manually fill up their actual map by moving the landmarks around. I really like how manual this is. There is very little automation, and the player actually has to build everything themselves. I think it also naturally splits the game into different phases, but it doesn't force the player to do anything. So for example, they can technically try to deliver a package right at the start without having to search for fragments, which is possible, although much harder. I just want to point out that this remains a fairly simple idea, which is fine by me. I'm not trying to make something you'd play tens of hours on, but rather a nice little game you may want to open for 20 or 30 minutes at a time, occasionally when you want to dive in its world. I did think about making a short story mode with unique gameplay and a wholesome story, but that does make the project a lot more ambitious, so I'm going to shelve it for now. Then there's the 2-player mode, which is actually the one I'm most excited about. I've mentioned it multiple times in the past episodes, but I will sum it up here one last time. Player A is in a third-person view, which allows them to look at the world, while player B is locked in the ship's hold in a first-person view, where they can see the map of the level but not the world. That means that they have to communicate together to figure out where they are and how to reach their destination. The ship controls are also split between the players, so player A can steer, while player B can set the sail amount, which controls the speed. On top of that, player B has a few tasks that will come up randomly. The idea is that from the moment these missions pop up for the player and until they are completed, the ship will be impaired. For example, you can't steer until the rudder is fixed. I have to say I've installed Sea of Thieves this week, and I did notice quite a few similarities of like the leak fixing, which is essentially exactly what I had in mind, or just a general way they are splitting tasks and the ship controls. So brace yourselves, Sea of Thieves, you have new competition now. On a more serious note, I really liked the game, and I'm quite relieved because I was afraid my project would be too similar, but I think it will be quite different in many ways. Now, I know this is not a game for everyone, and to be completely honest, I have no idea what I'm doing. I essentially have one process when making this game, which is asking the question, would I like playing it? Now, on a very different level, I have to figure out the different sailing mechanics, which I found surprisingly challenging. I'm usually trying to make games where the controls are snappy and reactive and satisfying, but boats are typically slow to react, which is part of what makes controlling them fun. So, after a bit of trial and error, here is the system that I currently have. There are 4 speed levels. No sail, 1 sail, 2 sails, and you guessed it, 3 sails. With each level, the ship gets faster, but the steering is increasingly slower. So when using 3 sails, for example, which is the maximum speed, steering is so slow it can essentially only be used for long straight lines. That forces the player to always try to keep a balance between their boat's speed and ease of control. Changing the amount of sails is quite slow, as you can see. So the player needs to anticipate, which helps keeping things somewhat challenging. On top of this basic movement, I added 2 mechanics to make things a bit more interesting. First of all, some boxes and barrels are distributed around the map. When the ship collides with them, it gets a short speed and steering boost, which makes it easier to control. The original idea here was to do something similar to the Pathless, when the player can go from box to box and move around the level quite quickly this way. Although for now I've simply toned it down to the occasional speed boost. Second of all, I have added wind zones. I felt like a global wind direction was a bit too limiting, so I created these local zones which can have any direction. When the player enters them, their speed will be affected by the wind, depending on whether their direction is matching with the wind or going against the wind. The idea behind these mechanics is to keep the game interesting even at the movement scale, because simply moving from point A to point B is a big part of the concept. To be honest, I'm not sure I'm there yet, and that's why I could use a bit of help. So I created a Google form in case some people would be interested in testing early versions of the game for 15 to 20 minutes and then answering a couple of questions. That would help me figure out whether people find things fun or just too complex or too boring, and try to adapt the game. On an unrelated note, and for those of you who are only in it for the shaders and the complex math, I will now quickly break down the system that I've made for my map. First of all, I need a top-down view of the terrain. For this I use an orthographic camera, which I already talked about in the first episode because I also use this top-down view in my ocean shader. I use a compute shader to quickly blur this top-down view, and then I send it to the map shader. Here I use different step functions in order to create a nice outline and to separate it from the background. I use a lerp function to overlay it on top of a pre-made map template, which I created in Figma. It's still a placeholder, and I will work on it a bit more down the line. Then I make the map look a bit older by using some noise to remove parts of it here and there. The empty map is now done, and I simply need to spawn a few game objects. These are the ports, the forests, and the landmarks. To do it, I simply instantiate a map version of these, and I position them by converting their world space to a map space, which is simple math. Finally, I add a bit of post-processing, most notably the depth of field when the player gets quite close to the map. With all of that, I get a nice little effect, which I think fits my needs for this game quite nicely. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.